Καλημέρα σας, είμαι ο Ιφικράτης Αμυράς από τον τηλεοπτικό σταθμό εδώ ΣΥΝΤΑΓΜΑ WEBTV. Σήμερα έχω την πολύ μεγάλη χαρά να φιλοξενώ τον Brady Kiesling, ο οποίος είναι συγγραφέας και πρώην διπλωμάτης, αμερικανός βεβαίως, ο οποίος βρίσκεται εδώ και πάρα πολλά χρόνια στην Ελλάδα και με τον οποίο θα μιλήσουμε για πάρα πολλά ζητήματα της πολιτικής επικαιρότητας. Brady Kiesling, καλημέρα και σε ευχαριστώ που ήρθες στην εκπομπή μας.
Καλημέρα και ευχαριστώ πολύ για την πρόσκληση.
Η συνέντευξή μας θα συνεχιστεί στα αγγλικά για να βοηθήσουμε τον Brady. Μου επιτρέπεις να σου μιλάω στον ελληνικό, μπορείς και εσύ να με λες Ιφικράτη. Έτσι. Brady, the first thing I would like to ask you is about your time in Greece, Athens, Greece. Could you please tell us about your involvement with archaeology and the classics, your studies in classics that you have done in Greece? First of all, when did you start here? When did you start your studies here?
Well, my first visit to Greece was in Christmas of 1978, driving with my brothers and my mother in a rented minivan all around the classical sites. I had been studying ancient Greek at Swarthmore College, and so I was reading the road signs as best I could using what little Greek I knew from Plato and Thucydides, but obviously fell in love with the country and found a way to come back for a year. As soon as I graduated from university, I went to the American School of Classical Studies on Suidia Street, and from there took part in the excavations at ancient Corinth, then went to graduate school at the University of California, Berkeley, studying ancient history and archaeology, dug in Archaea Nemea, in the little village there, and my introduction to Greek village life after Kolonaki, and then took the Foreign Service exam and eventually passed, and my dream was always to come back to Greece and serve here. It took a while. My first tour of duty was in Tel Aviv, Israel, where I was first a vice consul doing visas and then the ambassador's aide. And then I spent 2 years in Casablanca, Morocco as the economic officer there. But finally a job opened in Athens as a junior political officer at the American Embassy in the summer of 1988. And I spent 4 happy years there, traveling all over the country, seeing archaeological sites in my spare time. My wife was also a student of archaeology. We met at Nemea, and we dragged our young daughter to every archaeological site in the country. We even came here on our honeymoon, so we have seen probably more of Greece than most Greeks have, and have climbed over every rock and tried to read the inscriptions. And I have to say, it has been a wonderful experience being here. I came back again, obviously, in 2000, this time as chief of the political section. And after I resigned in 2003, I spent 1 year at Princeton at the university to launder myself, and then came back for romantic reasons. My partner Regina lives in the Plaka, and I've been here ever since.
All right, Brady. I would like to ask you about your book, Diplomacy Lessons, that you have written. It's a book that you mention a lot of things about the United States Foreign Service and how the United States designs the foreign strategy, the strategy policy. And I would like to ask you about the so-called rules of the game, that you mention a lot of practical advice for the students of international politics and diplomacy. Could you please tell us about your book?
When I resigned from the Foreign Service in February of 2003, it was obvious to me that the rhetoric in Washington from the Bush administration showed no idea at all of what diplomacy was and how it worked. And I resigned precisely in protest because diplomacy had been ignored. And the point of diplomacy is very simple. you have to know enough about foreigners to know what they want and need so that you can get from them what you want and need at a reasonable price by making an efficient exchange of favors. It turns out that holding a gun to people's head is a very expensive way to get what you want from them. Bribing them is a very expensive way to get what you want from them. But if you talk to them, listen to them properly, you can very often find a way to convince them that what you are doing is in both your interest and their interest, and they should do it for nothing. Mm-hmm. And that's what diplomats do. It's not always possible, but the fundamental rules are you have to understand that what is important in foreign countries is the same thing as what's important in your country, which is domestic politics. Politicians like to see the world as a stage on which they can look good to their people back home. And frankly, that's logical. At home, politics is all about resources. I'm taking this money from you to give to somebody else, and you are going to object to that. Whereas in foreign policy, at least to your intended audience of voters, you can say, I am a strong, muscular, macho, alpha male, and I am, projecting power on the world, and I am looking tough in doing it. And you can do it relatively cheaply. It turns out, however, that a superpower does not have the luxury of being stupid in foreign policy, simply because we're large enough that we can screw up the whole world if we make mistakes. And when we invaded Iraq, we made such a mistake. We totally destabilized a country. We changed the balance of power in the region in a way that we don't really like, and neither do most of the countries in that region. It cost us trillions of dollars, and we're not going to see any profit from it. The idea that we had some sinister ulterior motive for it is ridiculous. At the same time, it is also ridiculous to think that the world will understand our true motives when, in fact, this is we are a species that loves fantasies, loves conspiracies, and is not particularly interested in the truth. And so the basis of my book, the subtitle was Realism for an Unloved Superpower. Mm-hmm. And what that means is realism is what works. It's not the traditional sense of realism, which is we are all in it for our own sordid interests and do whatever we can. Realism is saying, this is how much this will cost. And if you ignore people's very strong moral instincts, their sense of nationalism, their sense of patriotism, you will run up against a brick wall, and you will pay a lot of money, and you will lose a lot of lives. Realism is knowing how people behave and respecting that when you make your decisions.
We can see from what you're saying that the United States of America created more instability in the Iraqi region than the Saddam period, all right? Do you agree with this statement? I mean, they went there, the United States invaded Iraq, with the perception that they are going to stabilize the area, to overthrow Saddam, and instead we have a completely destabilized area, right? Now, I think, according to my opinion, that we have much more terrorism than before, okay, and many more problems. And now we see that Iraq is going to θα τριχοτομηθεί, πώς λέγεται στα αγγλικά, θα μας το πεις εσύ, να γίνει σε τρία μέρη, στο σιητικό, στο σουνιτικό και στο κουρδικό μέρος, και θα προκύψουν πολύ περισσότερα προβλήματα. Απάντησε μόνο στα αγγλικά, εσύ δεν χρειάζεται να απαντήσεις στα αγγλικά.
It's clear that for the Iraqi people, the situation is worse than it was under Saddam's time, for most of them. For the Kurds at the moment, I think the situation is better. Mm-hmm. In fact, within the Kurdish area, a relatively legitimate, relatively well-functioning government exists. It's been able to bring in even tourists now, but certainly investment. In the south of the country, however, where there is no clear border between Sunni and Shiite districts and tribes, finding the idea that you can simply divide the country neatly into either the separate countries or separate autonomous districts, it's not working well. There's a huge deadly battle going on. It's a different battle in each region of Iraq because the balance of forces is different, you know, the tribal situation is different. We as a government paid no attention to that reality when we went in. We believed that Saddam used the methods he used because he was evil, whereas in fact he used the methods he used because Iraq was an artificial state that could be held together only by means that no outsider would care to use. And that's why I resigned, because it was clearly a disaster, and it has been a disaster. It's not been, the world isn't that much more dangerous. Iraq would have had some of those problems in any case when Saddam died, but we precipitated it and we bear the moral responsibility because we should have known better.
I would like your estimation about the new situation now in Iran. We have been hearing for many years that the United States and Israel and Western allies are going to bomb Iran. You said that's highly unlikely, but there is a big but. There are two factors that may overturn this situation, and maybe now we are in a dangerous period. Could you please elaborate on this?
Under normal circumstances, the American military establishment would look around and say, attacking Iran at this point would be insane. We do not have the troops, we do not have the political backing, and we do not have a set of targets that could be attacked that would lead to a better political situation than we have now. The US goal is to keep Iran from becoming a nuclear weapons state. It's not clear that that goal is achievable. The dangerous situation now is that Israeli domestic politics are utterly obsessed with the idea that Iran's developing a nuclear weapon is a direct, fatal threat to the existence of Israel. Israel will do anything it sees necessary to block that threat, including launching massive air strikes and who knows what else. The United States has successfully deterred Israel from doing that until now. Unfortunately, the United States is in a pre-election period. President Obama is up for election in 2012. All of the Republican candidates, except for one or two, see Iran as a perfect issue to show that they are tougher and braver and better than President Obama. And war is very popular, especially if you don't have to fight it. You know, we love watching gladiatorial combat. We love seeing bombs dropped on people. I mean, not just Americans, Greeks, everybody likes it. And the Republicans are promising mass entertainment in the form of war with Iran, and Obama has to defend himself against the domestic political threat that if he blocks Israel, the Likud-niks in Washington will work very hard to undermine him with Jewish voters who traditionally vote Democratic. And so he is under tremendous pressure to sit back and let Israel do something completely foolish, even in the knowledge that it will cause a major flare-up in the Middle East. It will probably disrupt the supply of oil to Europe for 5 years. It will cause the destruction of several of the neighboring states. It could cause Pakistan to go to war with someone. Anyway, the implications are pretty dire, and we should all look for ways to support Obama and his team of more cautious people in doing the right thing, which is sitting on the Israelis on this.
Mm-hmm. I would like to turn to internal politics here in Greece. Brady, I know that for many years you have been following the Greek political scene, and especially whatever has to do about the clashes between the Greek police and different anti-authority groups and movements. I would like a comment from you about the violence in this war, and not just in the Exarchia area, but first of all I would like a comment on the legitimacy of the Greek state in this particular period. Do you think that in this period the Greek state has a legitimacy problem, and therefore any kind of violence against the state and the police is justified? I do not want a yes or no answer, obviously, but I want you to analyze for our audience the implications of this war, because we see a climax, right? It started after 2002 when the November 17th was caught by the police, but after that we see a lot of smaller groups in a kind of network, connected through a network, to use more and more violence against the Greek state. And now that we have this political and financial situation and the crisis of legitimacy of the Greek state, we see this violence is exploding with mass demonstration, with a lot of Molotov from the side of demonstrators, with a lot of chemicals from the Greek police, Greek riot police. Give us your opinion about this situation, because I think it's not now, right? It didn't appear now. We have almost a decade of violence between these two camps.
Well, Ifikratis, thanks. That's a huge question. I've just completed a study of Greek political violence since 1967, since the anti-junta resistance, mostly focusing on 17 November, but I've also looked at the more recent groups. And indeed, the Greek state is facing a crisis of legitimacy. And when there is a crisis of legitimacy, there is a tendency for armed groups to surface, to challenge the state's monopoly of violence, to say there is an alternative to that state. And the groups that are active now in Greece tend to call themselves anarchists. Some of them now call themselves nihilists, but from the broader anti-authority movement. And their goal is, their professed goal is very straightforward: to overthrow the existing state and existing society. And if you share that goal, then obviously mass violence is a logical tool. But now we come to the real question. Why is the Greek state losing its legitimacy? Mm-hmm. It's losing its legitimacy because it is not providing what the Greek people expect from their government, and is in fact imposing sacrifices that the Greek people are not psychologically prepared to make. And this gets to the issue of the Greek economy and the future of Greece as a nation, as a country, as a state. For most of its history, Greece has been a poor country that has either shipped out its workers as immigrants to send money home, or else it has relied on loans from foreigners that it has not been able to pay back. And the triumph of the Semitis government in the 1960s was to open the floodgates for cheap, abundant credit, which Greeks used to build themselves lifestyles that were more expensive than their country could sustain. Now, and in the process, well, the mechanism for channeling European Union money and loans to the Greek people was primarily through the growth of the state sector. Hiring everyone, to work for 6 months as a garbage collector so they can then move to an office job and then move to a job where they not only do nothing but have the right to extort money and bribes from other people. And this was unfortunately unsustainable because it relied on an infinite supply of cheap credit. And the United States is reaching its credit limit, perhaps. Greece reached its credit limit quite a long time ago. And now the Greek state has two choices, and only two. Either make an arrangement with the bankers where Greece tightens its belt and pays back most of what it owes over time, accepting a huge cut in lifestyle, or else Greece turns its back on the debt and accepts to live on it, essentially on its own resources as a drachma country. And that choice also will impose a massive cutback in Greece's standard of living. And the question is, which choice do you make and how do you make it? Do you make it in an orderly manner or do you make it in a disorderly manner? But you have to choose one or the other. And the Greek state has made the choice to stay with the euro, to stay with the European Union, to find a way to maintain its some kind of future creditworthiness in a long, slow, painful process. And it is a logical approach. And I think if you ask most Greeks that question in a fair manner, as in the referendum that that Papandreou wanted to call, Greeks would accept that this is the better choice of the two. But it is a choice. Now, however, we have the groups who would prefer the other choice, and their ally in this is the groups, the anti-authority movement, which essentially wants to topple every state. And this government is easy to delegitimize. Well, the Papandreou government was losing its legitimacy because of its inability to offer the things the state is supposed to offer. The new government lacks the legitimacy of elections, and the only legitimacy it has is the fact that Lucas Papademos is a knowledgeable, impressive, reasonable person who offers as good a chance as any human being does in Greece of making the current course succeed. And whether it's a good, I think the odds of success are 50% at best. And the people who would like him to fail are out in the streets with Molotov cocktails. And
not just them.
Not just them. But I personally think that whichever choice you make, either drachma or euro, imposes very painful, very sharp sacrifices. Those sacrifices will be made in any case, but if you make them in the correct way, the sacrifices will have a reward in 10 years. If you make them in the wrong way, Greece will become like Albania under Hoxha, a miserable country dominated by little gangs of, little mafias, essentially. In Albania, the mafias were clan groups with political ties. In Greece, I think the outcome that's most likely, if the anti-authority figures have their way, will be a society dominated by the mafia, like in South Italy, and that's not a very encouraging
Brady,
aspect.
Brady, the context of your answer involves the financial argument that Greece took a lot of loans, those who were in government and some of the people mistreated all this money, and now they have to pay the price. That's the general context, all right? But there is another context, the political context, that Greece now, and not only Greece, but throughout Europe, we see a democratic deficit, that people are losing their national sovereignty because of some bankers who want to impose incredible measures that some of the people are called them barbaric. They see that there is a complete rupture between European elites and European peoples. So there is another context which does not does not involve the ideology, the nihilist ideology of the authority dash anarchist group. There are a lot of people who say that the European elites now are a gang of bankers who are using financial weapons, and they want to impose their will against all the people of Europe, not just the Greeks. Right? So there is another political context which justifies not only Molotovs, but a European revolution. What's your comment?
A country has as much sovereignty as it can pay for. And sometimes you don't have to pay money, sometimes you pay in blood. But if you're not willing to pay, sovereignty is a completely fictitious concept. Because sovereignty is the right to exert your power as you see fit. If you have no money, if you have no ability to protect power, you don't really have sovereignty. And Greece has sacrificed its sovereignty many times over its history, essentially to keep money flowing in, to maintain the state that it supports. It's a very expensive state, and remember, it's a state it's a very democratic state. Politicians are elected here because they put your child in the post office. And so when you complain about your politicians, are you complaining about the fact that your child had a job in the post office? Or are you only complaining now because he's about to lose his job in the post office because you did not elect politicians who would be willing to balance the books? And that's the fundamental issue. The word sovereignty is misused, usually, like patriotism. Patriots, most of them are out there to pick your pocket, to convince you that they have a magic solution to a problem that in fact cannot be solved, and while you are staring at them rapturously, they are reaching their hand in to take your money. Be very suspicious of all of these groups. And I've watched this in the United States, I've watched this in Greece. The only thing that everyone is happy to spend money on is tanks and airplanes for the military. And if by happy coincidence, tanks and airplanes, there are massive kickbacks from them. The profit margins are huge. Everybody gets rich. And at the end of the day, they will sit in rust because the state doesn't have the money to buy the fuel or the spare parts for them. Anyway, that's an aside there. But no, genuinely, the issue of national honor, the honor that this happiness that people feel from belonging to a state, that should be separated from the idea of financial prosperity. Greeks were happier, I think, in the 1950s when they were poor than they are now, because your happiness is always a comparative measure of how you are doing against your neighbors. And living in a world where you are miserable because you are driving a Volkswagen rather than a Porsche Cayenne, you know, I mean, that's ridiculous, but I mean, I ride a bicycle and I'm perfectly happy, and I think that we're going to have to go back to that.
So you think that the whole issue is just balancing the books? Because what is happening now, Brady, in Greece, and not only in Europe, we saw it before in Asia, we saw it before in Latin America, and there we had socialist movements like the one in Venezuela, and we see movements, Islamic movements in the Middle East, and also we see in Asia a lot of popular movements trying to go against the so-called Western capitalism, or the casino capitalism, or the IMF organization. So it is not just some anti-authoritarian groups that, anti-authority groups that go against the Greek state. I think it is more general.
Oh, of course, it is. Much of the Greek population correctly says that the system in Greece is rotten and needs to be radically reformed. The problem is that you reach that decision and then you have to face the consequences of that realization, which are, you cannot reform people by telling them to reform. I mean, at a certain point, a bureaucracy becomes immune to reform. And, you know, the usual cure for a sclerotic bureaucracy is the Mongols invade and sweep everything clean and you have to start all over again. And obviously we'd all like something better than that, but it will require, politics is about making difficult choices. That is, someone is going to keep his job and work, and someone is going to lose his job, and either the state or the individual is going to have to find a way to keep the person who loses his job from being forced to sleep in his car while his children do not have shoes to go to school in. And this is there are enough resources in Greece to assure a reasonable standard of living for people if those resources are used wisely. Is there a political system in Greece that is capable of using those resources wisely? You know, the free market is very good at generating resources. It's very bad at distributing resources. Socialism is good at distributing but not at generating. And obviously, we've all believed in a mixed economy of some kind where you use the energy and creativeness of capitalism and the social justice of socialism. And I don't believe that model is dead yet. I think there is still plenty of life in it if people, you know, if people look around and talk to their neighbors and say, this is a human problem, we are human beings, all of us have rights and dignities, and our solution has to protect rights and dignities, but it has to protect them on the basis of the resources available and not some complete fantasy that if we just throw out the bankers, suddenly we'll find a pot of money somewhere. Or the Russians will give us a pot of money, or the Chinese will give us a pot of money, because that's ridiculous.
All right, since you mentioned Russians and Chinese, I would like to mention that in Greece, there is a percentage of the voting public that wishes the Greek foreign policy to reorientate against the Western allies. I mean, there are a lot of people talking about Greece getting out, not only out of Eurozone and European Union, but out of Western alliance. And I'm not talking about the extreme left, okay? They, either for cultural reasons or because they do not like America, they wish to find allies in Russia and China. This is a real issue. It's not only issue of the Western, of the extreme left. All right? What's your comment about that? Don't you think that if we continue with these extreme financial measures, with the austerity measures, that a lot of people will say, all right, I cannot take more of this medicine. I cannot take it anymore, all right? Let us get out of Eurozone and even NATO. They're talking about NATO. And find Russia, because they think Russia will protect us. It's a real issue.
Well, Russia will protect Greece for a price, just as NATO protected Greece for a price. And a lot of Greeks have this historical view that the Russians are stupid peasants, and you send them the ayazoni and cart it around, and the Russians will throw money at it, and you will take it home to Athens. But in fact, the Russians are not any stupider than anyone else. Mm-hmm. They are cold, cruel, calculating like the bankers. And if Greece has to ask itself, if we prostitute ourselves to the Russians, what is their taste in prostitutes? And can we uphold that taste of theirs? And I think everyone will just have to look around and say, what do I have to sell to the Russians? Is it my, well, it will be islands or children or something. If at the moment we're following some very interesting discussions where Russia's traditional friends, Ukraine and Belarus, are complaining because they had favorable natural gas deals, and now the Russians are insisting that they pay market price. Mm-hmm. So there may be 2 years in which Greece gets cheap natural gas from the Russians, but at a certain point they will say, you pay with everyone else. Mm-hmm. And then Greece will have to empty its pockets to them the way it currently does mm-hmm. to people in Brussels.
Mm-hmm. Can I ask you something else? Do you see an alternative to the austerity policy, not only in Europe, but also in the United States? Why I'm asking this question? Because, Brady, I see in the United States a lot of movements say that we do not want our schools closed. We do not want our police officers and fire departments to close down, all right? Because in the United States, we see a similar situation. Of course, not so extreme as in Greece, but we see a lot of states facing financial problems that they cannot pay the state employees. And a lot of people in America have the same problems as in Greece, right? Do you accept this?
Yes, definitely.
All right. And they say, we don't like the bankers in Wall Street.
Yes.
So it's not only a Greek and European phenomenon. It's also an American phenomenon.
Oh, very, very clearly. The United States is making exactly the same mistakes Greece has made. The only difference is our economy is so much larger, our credit limit is so much greater that we have not hit our real crisis yet, but we will hit it at some point. I mean, the definition of something unsustainable is that it will not be sustained. Mm-hmm. And whether it's in 2 years or 10 years, the U.S. will have this crunch. And so all of us need to look for answers, and the answers are going to be similar. One of the crucial problems now that I see is that we're in a period of transitional technology, because logically what Greece ought to be doing is jump-starting its future economy with investments in green energy, mm-hmm. Better tourist infrastructure, rewriting property laws to make investment in Greek holiday homes more attractive to foreigners. And currently, Greek law is so difficult that it acts as a massive tax on investment, and people stay away. That said, I am not at all sure that the current generation of wind generators or the current generation of solar panels is something Greece wants to spend billions of euros on, simply because in another 2 years they will be much better. Mm-hmm. But that's a tough question for you. But at a certain point, the free market is going to have to decide that what gets invested in, because states, when they invest in alternative technology, do a really bad job of it, and the money gets wasted. It gets poured down the same rat hole that the money has been poured down for the past 30 years. So there has to be some deregulation. Deregulation, however, that respects the fact that Greece is a tourist country, and if you blight the landscape too horribly, people will not come, or at least the people you want to attract will not come. And there's always someone you can find who will lie on your beach, but this is a person who prefers to spend 15 euros a day rather than 500 euros a day.
You said that America has similar problems, or is doing the same mistakes as the Greek government. Am I right?
Yes.
All right. So by this, you mean that in a few years, American governments will have to take similar austerity measures against the American people in order to survive. Is that true?
Individual states already are taking those measures. We're seeing some of that in California, my home state, where for several decades there's been a strict limit on how much the state can raise in taxes. But there's been no limit on the services that people demand and the services they've been promised, and particularly the pensions to public sector employees. And that bill there is a huge boulder sitting on the head of the state of California, which will at some point crush it unless there's a major change. And here we reach the problem that democracy is easy when there's lots of money to go around, because you pay your rivals to go away. At the moment, there are not lots of resources to go around, and democracy becomes a very tough, nasty game. Because in Washington, we're seeing exactly the same thing between Republicans and Democrats as between New Democracy and PASOK. Samaras made very clear that his goal is to win the next elections. Since he has no plan for saving Greece, he will at least allow his government to plunder it for a few months before the final collapse. And his goal is to prevent PASOK from doing the same thing. There's no faith on either side that the goal is really to save the country. And I think this is disgraceful, but it's a fact of human nature. And now we are in the sad position of having to look to foreigners to force Greek politicians to behave responsibly.
I would like to ask you something else. You say, I understand that your involvement with culture has given you a wider perspective. I mean, don't you think that the problem with the Western situation, with the politics in the West, has a cultural dimension? I mean, there is a counter-culture movement from the 60s, right? Not just now, that questions the whole system. And why am I saying this? That there are people who say, no, it is not only the books, the balancing of the books. We have some people, only the 1% of the people that holds the majority of the wealth, and the 99% of the people are poor. This kind of rhetoric feeds revolutionary feelings, and we see that a lot of young people are questioning their faith not only against the Western governments, but against the Western culture. Don't you see that? Don't you think that this is a real issue also? That we have a cultural revolution, a cultural people who say that this Western civilization has rotten, it's not good enough, it doesn't fulfill our dreams. Don't you think that there is a problem here, a serious problem?
Every culture, by definition, has its counterculture. And the Western counterculture is interesting because the whole idea of Western civilization since the Enlightenment has been, you know, the triumph of the individual, you know, his freedom against an oppressive collective. You know, we're the antithesis of the Chinese model that says that every individual is a small cog in a huge machine that supports the common good. And we rebelled from that. And obviously, either individualism taken to extremes or collectivism taken to extremes is going to result in disaster. I mean, the counterculture movement that I lived through, the hippies and the yippies, which is very similar, in fact, to the groups I saw at Occupy Wall Street when I was in New York last month, and to the groups you see in Exarchia. Again, this is the elevation of individual liberty. And it's admirable for the people who can find a way to make it work. A handful of people can live off the grid, can support themselves in sort of less structured, less hierarchical systems. And what I would argue is that Western society has been wealthy enough and liberal enough to allow these subcultures to live and, in fact, to enrich the collectivity. I mean, Athens would be far poorer without the art and rhetoric that comes out of Exarchia. At the same time, most people do not want to live in a non-hierarchical society. We are programmed since we were chimpanzees millions of years ago to want to live in a hierarchy. Most of us, not all of us. I mean, I was never very good at the State Department because I didn't have the right appreciation for hierarchy. I do not feel comfortable telling other people what to do. And that's just my personal problem. But most people in Greece or anywhere else love being able to tell people what to do. And you have to accept that's a fact of nature, accept that a society is going to be diverse. There will always be a culture and a counterculture, and the idea is that in a healthy civilization, you have both enriching the other.
Brady, you have written a book about November 17th, the revolutionary organization that took many lives and during a span of almost 30 years, right? And I would like you to give us some details. First of all, I have seen in your website, you mentioned that the Greek police, when arrested some of the members of the November 17th, gave a lot of inaccurate accounts about what happened. Could you please tell us about these inaccuracies? What did you mean by that?
When Savas Xiros blew himself up in 2002, good police work led to one Yafka on Patmos Street, led to a very large amount of evidence. Following up on Savas's family and friends led to more evidence. The police then used that evidence to persuade Savas to sign a confession. But Savas cooperated to the extent of signing a confession, and he told the police some things, but he did not spill his guts completely. And the confession that he wrote, the confession the police wrote on his behalf, the confession that his brother Christodoulos signed, all of the confessions are a reconstruction by the authorities of what they thought was true at the time on the basis of the evidence they had. They had some help from Savas. They also had some deliberate lies from Savas. It was a mixture. Savas logically was trying to protect as many people as he could, and he also had people he did not mind harming, and the result was a series of confessions which were useful for the police in one specific thing, which is attaining the conviction of as many people as possible as members of 17 November. Mm-hmm. And then at the court, the court essentially accepted those confessions, not quite blindly. If there was clear evidence contradicting a confession, that part of the confession would be ignored. But they never asked the question, well, if this part of the confession is wrong, then how do we know the rest of it is right?
Exactly.
Anyway, having watched part of the trial and seen some of the contradictions, I went back to the little bit of hard evidence there was, specifically what 17 November had written, what Ella and other groups had written, and then, most importantly, the three financial notebooks of the organization, where over a period from 1990 to 1997, the expenses of the organizations were written down with little code names and justifications. And if you put those all into a spreadsheet, analyze them very carefully, you start to learn things, how many members the group had, how important they were active, when they stopped being active. In a few cases, the people who were clearly involved in something or not clearly involved. Unfortunately, when you do that, you come to the conclusion that some of the identifications between code names and real suspects cannot be right. Mm-hmm. For example, I mean, the most obvious one is the police could not decide whether a code name, well, whether Kostaris, one of the Thesprotians, whether he was Haris or Takis. Mm-hmm. And so they wrote confessions that implicated him as both. But he cannot be both, mm-hmm. because both Haris and Takis get paid regular Christmas, Easter, and summer vacation bonuses, and one person is not going to be receiving bonuses on the same day. Exactly. For two different code names. I mean, impossible. Little things like that. And if you work at it, you can come up with a reconstruction that fits the notebooks better, and I think fits other facts better. I can't say it's true because I don't have enough evidence. I simply, in my book, I lay it out there for people to judge. But more importantly, I give the actions of 17 November, Ella, and their rival groups in their political context, explain how the real rivals of 17 November were not the state, but rather the other revolutionary movements who are competing for the same audience, same left audience, and that makes their behavior much more comprehensible than it is when you claim that they worked for the CIA or the other shadowy, sinister forces.
I will ask you later about these conspiracy theories, but first of all, I would like to point out that because of these mistakes by the Greek prosecuting service, we don't know yet, for example, in the case of Bakoyannis murder, we don't know exactly who was involved and who did what. Do you agree with this? Because they try to put all the blame on Christodoulos Xiros and others, but from the reconstruction of the scene, I think that we don't know yet who killed him. All right? Would you agree with this?
I agree with that. There are enough peculiar details there to make me, well, to cast grave doubt on Savas Xiros' confession. Also, Koufoudinas, in a unique intervention in court, said something that made clear that Kostaris could not have been one of the participants in that case. And I happen to believe that Koufoudinas would not have lied on that issue. And in fact, there's a logic to what he says. And so Kostares was convicted unjustly of that murder. He may be guilty of other murders, I don't know, but the strong implication is that this particular incident was a miscarriage of justice.
Something else. Do you think that from the trial that you followed, do you think that Alexandros Giotopoulos is the leader of the group? There is a lot of there are a lot of questions about this. Everyone said from the beginning that he was the chief, he was the leader of the organization. Would you agree with that? Although I do understand that a yes or no answer is very difficult, but would you like to give an opinion about that?
I tend to agree with what Saradelis said when he was on trial during the junta for dynamite possession, and he said, we don't have leaders, gangs have leaders, Simorias. And the members of 17 November had a strong libertarian streak to them and were not very comfortable with hierarchies. I think ideologically, Giotopoulos came from a tradition that believed in leaders, but if he had tried to play the role of absolute leader of the group, most of the people would have left. I think it was a collective process, and like many organizations, the people who do the work have the influence. And Koufoudinis did the work. He was very influential, but there are at least two other people who were quite influential, at least one of whom has not been identified yet. And several have not been identified, and not that they're active anymore, but the picture of Giotopoulos as the ethikos aftergos of all of 17 November's crimes strikes me as very dubious.
So you say that you think that there is a section of the organization still at large?
The organization went through a bunch of changes of membership over time. I think most of the people who were never identified had already left by 1997 or 1998, but there are a couple of more recent members that haven't been named. I don't think they're ever going to be found. Essentially, when we say that the police made a mistake, the police had very little time in which to persuade Savas and the others to talk before the lawyers came in and everything froze. They made the best guesses they could at the time, and having made those guesses, they were forced to stick with them even when they knew they were wrong. And so they got what has to be. It's not a matter of incompetence, it's a matter of realism that truth was not possible in the trial, and truth is not even what a trial is about. A trial is about justice, which has nothing to do with, well, not necessarily much to do with truth.
You mentioned the word incompetence, and here we are going to open the chapter of conspiracy theories, because the first argument of the conspiracy theorists is that, hey, just a moment, Mr. Brady, you said that the Greek police was not incompetent, all right? But why, for almost 30 years, could not find them?
Some Greek police were quite incompetent. I don't think Syros and Biotis were particularly incompetent, though.
All right, I got your point. But they say, the conspiracy theories goes, that for 30 years, they couldn't touch them. Now, why? They give the answer. Because they had inside information, because some political cycles protect them, or because foreign secret agencies have infiltrated them and provided assistance or guidance, or they were provocateurs. Now, I'm making this question, and I would like you to elaborate on this, because the conspiracy theories are a whole industry. Is that right? And we see them not only in Greece, but also in your country after the terrible events of September 11th.
People are not interested in truth. They do not know what truth means. People have evolved to tell stories and to be entertained by stories. And we will pay for a good story, we will not pay for the truth. If the truth happens to be a good story, we will appreciate it, but we will not appreciate it for its truthfulness, only for its entertainment value. But there's also another issue. The lie that 17 November was a provocatori oργάνωση created by the CIA or other dark forces was invented immediately after the killing of Welch in 1975 by the Communist Party of Greece, the Kappa Kappa Epsilon, which was determined to preserve its control of the communist movement. It was by definition the vanguard of the movement, and anyone who threatened its leading role by doing things that it didn't dare do itself had to be neutralized politically. And so from the first moment, all of their loyal journalists spread the lie. It's the CIA settling accounts with itself. You know, and Eleftherotypia, which was dominated by communist newspapers, took the lead there. But it was followed by everyone else. Even the right had a similar desire to sort of ward off the ill effects of this by saying it had nothing to do with us, it was foreigners, it was, and this sort of desire for collective irresponsibility. You know, it's not a sign of a healthy society, but as you pointed out, we have exactly the same thing with the September 11th attacks in the United States, where it is utterly obvious that a group with a very specific political purpose staged a very specific attack for very specific knowable reasons. And you know, I've studied 17 November now for 6 years. I've read everything that they've written, I mean everything I could anyway. I've read the financial notebooks. If you read what they've written, they're as well informed as anyone can be who reads Eleftherotypia, Vima, Andi magazine. They don't have any special sources of information. Maybe a little bit of journalistic gossip, but nothing, no inside information that I can find. When you study the financial notebooks, you have them running out of money. You have them rob a bank, suddenly they have money and they spend it, then they run out of money again. They have a terrible 4-month period in basically October, November, December, beginning of January, well, 96, 97, where they have no money or are having to lend money to each other and they don't know how to pay the rent. And then they rob a bank again and suddenly they're rich and they pay back all their people. This is not the mark of a group that is being sponsored by outsiders.
They wouldn't have such a problem.
They wouldn't have such a problem. Look at the weapons they have. You can trace where they got them in almost every case. There are 1 or 2 things I haven't traced yet, but the vast majority we know exactly where it came from. So they didn't have special information, they didn't have money, they didn't have weapons, and if you look, they didn't really know how to shoot very well. Their bombs, a lot of them didn't work. There's no sign that they had any special training. So if they had foreign sponsors who didn't either give them money, training, information, or weapons, why the hell would they do what that organization wanted them to do? No, the logical answer is they were exactly what they said they were, with the proviso that once you start robbing banks, as Che Guevara warned, you become a bank robber. eventually the lifestyle elements do take over from politics. It happens to every organization. It's just a fact of life. But they were pretty close to what they said they were.
Let me do the devil's advocate, all right? Now, the answer from the conspiracy theorists is that, hey, just a moment, Mr. Brady, you said they couldn't have special information, but in some cases, for example, the first killing was the CIA officer in Athens, right? The station officer in Athens. How many people did they know this information? I don't know if it was widespread information. Now, that's the first one. The second one, they killed William Nordin and another officer, which at this time his name escapes me, which were military attaches here in Athens, and I think it's a very sensitive information. Not many people know this, right? You will tell me that if I'm wrong. So they did have, or at least they managed to obtain some sensitive information that it was not a widespread information, right? It was not easily to get that information. Am I right?
No. In this case, the information was easily available. The name and address and phone number of Richard Welsh, the CIA station chief, had been published in the Levthotypia, which borrowed it from the Athens News a month before he was killed. That said, 17 November knew about him months before, as they made clear in one of their own proclamations. But the CIA station chiefs were important people in Athens society back then. It was an open secret. Now, as for the military attaches, it's quite clear from reading the trial transcript that 17 November simply watched the embassies, looked for people who wore fancy uniforms in good cars, who were treated with respect by the guards, and they knew that this was a senior person. But with Brigadier Saunders, for example, everything they put in their proclamation about him was wrong. They called him an Air Force pterarchos. He was in fact an infantry officer, a brigadier. He had never served in any of the places they said. He had nothing to do with the bombing of Serbia. And they made that up. And they saw he had a fancy gray uniform and thought, well, that looks more like the Air Force. Mm-hmm. And then they told a story about him and then lied about it afterwards.
What about William Nordin? I'm saying this, yeah. Why? Even if they knew some officers, the names of some American officers, yet I don't think they would know easily what is their job here. For example, I'm sure that CIA would have some secret agents here. Although the names could be known, they will be known as some trade associates or something like this. They will never be known as secret agents. Am I right? Andi
magazine published during the 70s long lists of alleged CIA officers, most of which were wrong, by the way. But, if you list 70 people at the embassy, at least,
some of them, you will have some success.
Not all of them will be wrong. Right. But, no, with Nordin, what's interesting about Nordin is that they did not know his name. In fact, they had been planning to kill someone else, and they wrote a proclamation to that effect. We have some guesses who it might have been, but then before the killing, they cut out that section of the proclamation and pasted in another piece of paper just saying the driver of the car with license plate so-and-so is an agent of the American imperialism.
So you insist that a lot of things they did were not planned as well as as the Greek police or some others believe. All right.
There was a fundamental lack of interest in their foreign victims. For their Greek victims, they did their homework to some degree, but For example, when they killed Bakoyannis, it was a catastrophe because they did not even realize that the day they killed him was the day that Parliament was voting on whether to indict Papandreou. So the killing had a catastrophic wrong political message. And they explained in a later proclamation that, well, we chose the day for operational reasons. The street of our escape route had been closed for road work for the past 2 weeks, so we couldn't get him then. And
that could be true.
Yeah, no, it was true.
From operational point of view.
But when you allow an operational concern to destroy the political impact of your action, that's the work of amateurs. It's not the work of serious terrorists.
Let's go to another point of view. Let us agree for a moment that it was not the construction of CIA as the conspiracy theory says. But what about the infiltration theory, that some foreign agents could have infiltrated the organization and try to divert their targets? What about this?
Well, Danos Christalis came fairly close to them, apparently without ever knowing it. At least that's been said by one of the defendants, and I actually believe it. There's good reasons to think it's true. But if they had been infiltrated, remember, first of all, there was a huge reward offered. Secondly, intelligence services use information to buy and sell. I mean, if the CIA had infiltrated them, that information would be used to make the CIA station, or make CIA station chief a hero to Washington and the CIA director a hero to the president and the public. When the CIA loses, Welch was the first CIA officer ever to be assassinated, and the CIA swore revenge. And you should not take these oaths lightly. I mean, they were very, very serious about getting them.
The second one, I think, was in Lebanon.
Yeah, exactly. And we spent millions and perhaps even billions of dollars tracking down those responsible, and not necessarily the money. Much of it was wasted, but that's another issue. No. If the KGB had infiltrated, they would have sold 17 November to the CIA for something at some point.
Something in exchange.
Yeah, because it's the usefulness of a group like this is so small compared to its usefulness to foreign capitals. So you would sacrifice them instantly.
All right. Let us go to a similar issue. We have the riots of December 2008, right? We see the whole city burning, and we heard again from the conspiracy theorists that foreign agencies, not just CIA, but Mossad or any other agency, had something to do with this. At least they pushed some people to go to this extreme. What is your opinion? And I'm talking about not just defending, all right, your country, but about the logic. Is it logical to claim that foreign agencies would have some benefit to push things so far? Because even if you say, Iφικράτη, no, I cannot think, or it's not logical, yet we see in history that governments do have some benefit if they cause chaos in an opposite country. For example, between Iraq and Iran during the 80s, when they were each other at war, right? Iran would have benefited if we saw Iraqi towns in chaos. Yes or no? So there is some kind of logic. You cannot exclude completely.
Okay. No, one cannot exclude completely. The United States policy is to support whatever government of Greece there is in achieving security and prosperity in Greece and the broader region. And why we would change our policy to embarrass Karamanlis is, well, let's put it this way. The State Department thought its policy was the policy I described. The Pentagon thought its policy was what I described. I think the CIA thought its policy was to cooperate as closely as it could with the Greek intelligence services on matters of mutual interest, such as terrorism. And why you would destroy all of that for some gain that I cannot see anyone in Washington who would profit from disturbance in Athens. And now when you look at current U.S. policy too, which is desperately to support the Greek government, sort of any Greek government, as it tries to avoid going bankrupt.
Okay.
Yeah, so anyway, it's not very likely. But the other point I'd like to make is when you watch the riots and see, 13-year-old children with cigarette lighters bending into trash cans to set them on fire. I mean, the people to blame for that is not the CIA, but those children's parents who either encouraged them to destroy social capital that their own taxes had paid to create, or else, the parents who neglected their children and sent them off to possibly get hit on the head with a rock, which I think is not a good idea. No, this was in the riots. Essentially, the stupidity and brutality of one Greek policeman caused the Greek state briefly to lose confidence in its right to govern. And everyone who had any opportunistic reason to come forward chose it. The people who came to smash windows and steal mobile phones, the people who wanted to overthrow the system and create a workers' paradise, kids who simply liked to set fire to things. And when I was 13, I actually liked setting fire to things too. We built little bombs in the basement, but we never hurt anybody. But the instinct is there. And when a society, well, basically Pavlopoulos, he sort of declared, "Don't hit me," and that was a license for everyone to go out in the street and indulge all of the anger they had been feeling that had built up over years.
Okay, let me continue with my devil's advocate's policy arguments. All right, the argument goes like this: CIA and other cycles in Washington did not like Mr. Karamanlis because he had opened some new friendship with the Russians, and because he wanted to push forward with the gas pipe of Burgas Alexandroupoli, whereas Mr. Papandreou later cancelled this project. So there is a theory that Karamanlis wanted to somehow be closer to the Russians and to diminish the cooperation with the West, and especially the United States. And perhaps for this reason, he was not liked by some circles in the United States of America. And therefore, these circles could perhaps help this anarchist, this movement to destroy the city. This argument is heard a lot, not by...
Look,
and it is not just a populist argument. You can see this kind of logic in some magazines like Pikera, if you follow this this magazine.
I'm sure there is at least one company in the United States that was quite annoyed at the Burgas Alexandroupoli pipeline and annoyed at Karamanlis for supporting it. And I'm sure that they did lobby the U.S. government to try to block that pipeline in favor of their pipelines. That's in Washington. There are thousands of competing interests, and there are interests, that were opposed to Karamanlis. On the other hand, there are the United States had dozens of very compelling national interests which say you need a strong, legitimate government in place, and you need Karamanlis to behave sensibly on various other things that are of equal importance. And the normal result is that it would be impossible for any government agency in the U.S. to get a green light from the White House to engage in that kind of subversion. It would be blocked by all the other interests.
Exactly.
So whether, that said, that anybody with $1,000 can probably rent a group of anarchists for a day. I mean, I don't know how much they cost. But I mean, if you were clever. But on the other, actually, no, that's not true. I'm completely wrong there. The anarchists are very suspicious of outsiders. They will not take guidance from outsiders unless they have known them for years and sort of know exactly what their motives are. I think they're much harder to manipulate than we give them credit for. Certainly,
let me get you to one other section of this theory. I know that you follow for some time the organization called Conspiracy of Fire Cells, right?
I just read their proclamations.
Yeah, and we know about another one, the so-called Sekta Επαναστατών, which actually killed Socrates Giolias, all right? Especially for these two, we heard that, yes, surely, why they killed this young journalist and the officers? They surely are members of CIA or whatever. No, because what is the argument? They are young boys. How could they kill in cold blood, etc., etc.? So your argument from another discussion we had is that how is it possible CIA to be so amateurs, to commit such mistakes, because most of them were caught, all right? So could you please tell us about this, that on the one hand we see a lot of people, serious people, and I'm talking about lawyers, scientists, they say, yes, this organization must have been a CIA agency, a front cover, or something like this. And on the other hand, we see they are doing a lot of amateurist mistakes, right? Could you please explain what is your position about this?
Well, a group like Sekta, if you judge them purely by their proclamations, they're just, a little group of angry narcissists. But if you, clearly they've had access to weapons. Clearly their political sense is not very good, because no one understood the killing of Giolias. Certainly, if they had a cause they were promoting, killing him did not promote that cause. I mean, 17 November, at least you could identify the logic they used for their choice of targets. It wasn't always a very good logic, but it was consistent logic. Here, it's you look at them more in the framework of organized crime and people, essentially vengeance killings for some crime that you don't even know what it is.
But on the other hand, from what you say, we can conclude that what they show to the people, these organizations, they must be true. They are not provocateurs or they are not agents. They are what they seem to be. Would you agree with this?
Oh, yeah.
Anarchists or anti-authoritarian
Well, they claim to be nihilists. Essentially, they say we have no politics except destruction, and that it's...
They are against the state, the Greek state. They are revolutionaries by using their own terminology, all right? So you say that they are what they seem to be.
Well, they are basically pure predators. They are determined to live off Greek society by theft and violence. In other words, they're like the mafia. And calling yourselves political because you've read a book by a nihilist or, copy-paste.
But don't you accept that at least they have some kind of political ideology, their own ideology, the anarchist ideology?
Well,
because anarchists anarchism had always a violent section, right?
Yeah,
a revolutionary section.
Okay, but there is most revolutionary anarchists have at least a social vision that's, you know, the idea that people can cooperate in a non-hierarchical, you know, free manner. And this group doesn't have any interest in that idea either. So they're not anarchists, and the anarchists, in fact, I think have made clear.
You're talking about the secta?
The secta, yeah.
All right. What about the conspiracy of fire cells?
No, the conspiracy,
they are more politicized, I think.
Yeah, well, but it's, you know, it's fascinating reading their proclamations, because it's, you know, it's clear that, you know, they did go to good schools and they learned to quote T.S. Eliot and Dylan Thomas and Shakespeare. Essentially, it is a coalition of intellectual snobs from the suburbs with adrenaline addicts, with you know, just sort of with performance artists.
But would you agree that their political analysis of the situation in Greece is above the average? We are not talking about young guys who just want to blow something just to get fancy. I think.
Well, I
think that
they have
a political ideology. They have a basis upon which they build their own attitude against the Greek state. They are not just, all right, we take guns and we kill. I don't think that the conspiracy of fire cells are just nihilist. I think...
Well, but if you read their proclamations, it's clear they're written by several different people with several different ideologies.
Exactly.
And they have, you know, the fraxia nihiliston is one of the tendencies there. They have a more traditional sort of, well, insurrectionist anarchist, but with a social component, and then you have others who seem to be interested, you know, revolution as a literary exercise.
Can I ask you something else? Don't you think that what happened recently in Greece justifies at least the political motives of the anarchist group? For example, we see that we have a government now which claims to be a legal government, although it hasn't come from elections at all, and we see that they refuse the people to have a referendum. So, doesn't this attitude against the people at least justify all these anarchists, revolutionaries, or whatever you call them, groups, to say, all right, we have a war. We have a war. We are not going to stay peaceful because these people are financially coerced us. They try to destroy us. Don't you think that what the Greek state is doing now against the Greek people at least justifies the political motives of all these groups?
Well, you have to look at means and ends. If your goal is to overthrow the Greek state, the greatest favor you can do the state is by committing murder. And we saw that in May of 2010 with the Marfin bank deaths, which took the largest and angriest demonstration I had seen in a long time and killed it completely. Everyone just walked home, you know, as if they were ashamed. And so political violence, in fact, is, I mean, that kind of deadly violence, in Greece at least, is directly harmful to the mass movement. So, you know, basically, I mean, if I were, no, I am not if I were advising the CIA, but if a group like Secta comes out and kills a politician now, they will strengthen the current government substantially.
Do you really think that?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Very clearly.
I can tell you that if someone kills a politician, not just a Secta, anyone at this particular moment, there will be a relief. This is my opinion.
Yeah, there will be a relief, but it's like it's the safety valve on a pressure cooker, and it lets out the tension, and people are appeased and they go home. I mean, it's human sacrifice calms people down, and what is what could destroy the current Greek state, if you want to destroy it, is the civil disobedience movement. The most dangerous thing that happened, and in fact I think why Papandreou called the referendum in a desperate bid for more legitimacy, was the then Plirono movement, and what happened, the sort of the civil disobedience against Papoulias in Thessaloniki.
So you will agree with a civil disobedience strategy to bring down, I'm not trying to give me an answer that I like, but would you agree with a civil disobedience strategy in order to bring change to the political system?
I'm handicapped because I'm not a revolutionary. I know that too many people in Greece have built themselves decent lives over decades, having come out of serious poverty, and now they have houses, they have telephones, they have a decent, dignified life. When the revolution comes, that will be swept away. The dignity will be gone. This will become a very wretched country for a long time. So this is, you have to be careful what you wish for. I mean, I have a sympathy with the argument that the system is rotten and needs to be swept away, but as a selfish person and a soft-hearted person, sweeping it away will cause such catastrophe that many of the people will wish they had never been born. Look at all the famous revolutions of history. Look at the Islamic Revolution in Iran, which was led by the middle class, which thought it was getting democracy, and what did they get instead? And look at the revolution in Cambodia, where you got Pol Pot. Most revolutions do not lead to the goal of the revolutionaries. They lead to the rise of a group that's more brutal and disciplined than you are. So unless you are very brutal and disciplined yourself, you shouldn't promote revolutions.
Just reform.
Yeah, I believe reform is good.
Okay, I accept your opinion. Coming to an end of our interview, I would like you to make a prediction about the Greek political situation. Do you think that there will be a safety valve for the system through elections, or do you think that we are going to continue with this kind of seething situation, a revolution that is seeming, and one day it's going to explode? What's your prediction? What do you hear from the American diplomatic cycles? Are they worried about the situation in Greece? Do you think that it's getting out of control?
Well, I don't have any useful contact with American diplomatic circles to know what they think. And if whatever they think, they can't really tell me because I might disclose it in an interview. So, so here's what I think. What Greece needs is a government that people will accept as having the right to make difficult decisions, that must choose, between, who gets paid and who doesn't get paid, until you can rebuild the economy on a new basis. There's going to be hardship, and the hardship, sharing it evenly all around without addressing the underlying causes of the hardship is pointless.
Exactly.
Which is happening now, and that's a disaster. So the current government, what it should do is it should be given 4 months, or 5 months, 6 months. I'd prefer a whole year to implement deep structural cuts. I mean, very serious cuts in the size of the state, simplification of the law, simplification of regulations, a freer, more neoliberal is bad because it has the implication that you're basically handing things over to the banks, but liberal in the sense of supporting human freedom and to the extent possible. but cut down the state, except that the result of that will be a population that is insanely angry, furious, vengeful, and then allow the politicians, or ideally new politicians, but new politicians, old politicians, people with a gift for governance, to come and essentially campaign against this government, which is at this point will be a punching bag and nothing else. Exactly. A campaign against the foreign pressure for reforms, and make the promise to rebuild the state in a healthier way. But you cannot do that until you've cut it back and pruned it to the level where you can then look at what you want the state to do, and rebuild those parts of the state that do that.
Many people would agree with this structural downsize, but on the other hand, we see that the private sector cannot absorb all this unemployment from the public sector, which is coming now, and we don't see any financial growth. So whatever the neoliberal message, we don't see any growth in the private sector. So when you downsize the state so quickly and in such large numbers, what will you do with these 300,000 people? They say they are going to fire 300,000 public employees. All right, let us assume that this is right. All right, okay, that it is good for the whole society. It's not good for them, but for the whole society. Where will these people go, right? The private sector, let's be frank, cannot absorb 300,000 now.
Yeah. Basically, for now, you have to take 95% of the money you save from firing those people and pay them to stay home and find something else to do. Keep them alive, but essentially get them out of the way while you rebuild the state. And then when you rebuild, bring back as many of them as you can, because with the right leadership, I see people working in state offices who are working very hard, very long hours, and trying to do their best in a system that gives them no incentive to work hard, exactly, and every incentive to just to play the political game.
Another mistake that I see as a very dangerous precedent is that this horizontal cutting down of the salaries, it's very dangerous. You see, as you said before, you don't give any incentive to the good employees. By this horizontal cutting down, I think they destroy the public administration. What's your opinion on this?
Well, I agree with that. I believe that
they are doing more harm than good. If their target is just to save some money, I think in the long run they will lose more because of the inefficiency of the public sector. Because when you say to the good employee, I'm cutting down 30% of your salary, he will have no incentive. Instead, he will have incentive to say to the citizen, give me some money below the table to do the job you want me to do.
Exactly. That you're exactly right. And the difficulty is that to keep one person and fire another person is a profoundly political decision, and the Greek state does not believe it has the legitimacy to make those decisions. I mean, and you need a legitimate state. And how do you build legitimacy now?
Some parties also afraid that there will be party criteria,
yes,
against those who are going to be fired.
Well, everything we've seen so
complicates
far
even more.
Yes,
complicates even more the situation.
Of course, and there is no faith that the system will be, that meritocratic principles will be used, and there's no agreement even on what constitutes merit. And it's a hugely difficult problem, and it is better to solve it through clear, sharp decisions taken now followed by a repair process that fixes the mistakes, rather than to drift along and do nothing, where we are guaranteed sort of a lifetime of misery.
One last question. Looking into Europe and seeing Italy and Spain fall in the same situation as Greece, do you see the Eurozone, I'm not talking about the European Union, do you see the Eurozone falling apart? Is it predictable? I mean, the foreign press say, yeah, it's a matter of time, not when. It's a matter of time. Not if it's going to happen, but a matter of when it's going to happen.
The political consensus for the Eurozone is much weaker than it was a year ago.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if it will fall apart. I know that there are strong both emotional and practical reasons for keeping it. I also know that in the case of Greece, the Eurozone provided short-term major benefits, but long-term costs.
Mm-hmm.
And since Greece did not invest the short-term benefits toward the long-term,
mm-hmm.
Now we're
exactly
now we're screwed. And how to preserving the Eurozone will require a massive effort from a Europe that at the moment doesn't have the self-confidence it had 10
mm-hmm.
years ago.
Exactly.
And a country like Greece that attempts to assert its proud independence but keep the benefits of the Eurozone is going to be laughed at.
Mm-hmm.
So Greece has to choose either to be proud or to be a member of the Eurozone.
But do you see the Eurozone falling apart, not because of Greece, but because of the other countries? Because Italy now is in almost the same situation as Greece.
I think the Eurozone is savable because the intrinsic European economy is not in such bad shape if looked at as a whole. There are massive imbalances, structural difficulties, but Europe's output and its input are basically matched pretty well. I mean,
mm-hmm.
it's in macroeconomic terms, Europe is okay. So the Eurozone can survive if there's a political will for it.
Mm-hmm.
At the moment, the political will is weak, but I think people are getting frightened, and I think that will may be found.
Mm-hmm. Brady, thank you very much for your interview, the interview you gave us. Αγαπητοί τηλεθεατές, φτάσαμε στο τέλος και της σημερινής εκπομπής. Να ευχαριστήσουμε λοιπόν τον John Brady Kiesling, πρώην Αμερικανό διπλωμάτη, ο οποίος είχε την ευγενική καλοσύνη να μας παραχωρήσει αυτή τη συνέντευξη. Ευχαριστούμε που μας παρακολουθήσατε. Γεια σας.
Γεια σας.